just
Okay.
Yeah.
So, facing towards you. All right. Well, good afternoon. Pleased to be here. And for my background, I'm sort of an analytic philosopher with a theology addiction. In other words, I got very interested in theology at a certain part of my career. And so I've looked into both. And so I'm very interested in applying the methods of analytic philosophy to theological questions, and you'll see that in the treatment that I give to the soul. Okay. So souls, as we know, are something that's recognized by classical philosophy. You see a lot of talk about souls in Plato and Aristotle. And also in Christian theology, it's a traditional position that we are body, soul, and spirit. Those three are clearly distinguished in 1 Thessalonians 5:23. Plato, of course, argued that the body is a prison house, and so for him and for later Neoplatonists and Gnostics, salvation is really a matter of escaping from the body. And this is, of course, not Orthodox Christian teaching. God creates the body. Matter is important to God. And the teaching about the resurrection of the body involves some interesting ideas. The idea that when we physically die, then we know that the soul goes to be with God. It's described in Revelations 6:9. And the resurrected body, now you have body and soul, but that body which was perishable now becomes imperishable with a physical body under the governance of the Spirit. And so the three dimensions of body, soul, and spirit are intended to be an integrated whole. That's really what a person is, very different from the Platonic teaching. So those are the three dimensions. Obviously the body is the physical organism, the soma, the spirit, the pneuma. We tend to think of this as the passive side of us because it is what is inspired, and we know that we do not make a contribution to our salvation. As Luther says, not by our own reason and strength do we come to believe in our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, why not? As you see, we are passive in regard to the influence of the Holy Spirit on our spirit. On the other hand, the psyche, or the soul, is the active dimension of a human being. And so here you think particularly of the works of reason and will and volition and choice. And so this is the package of a whole person. Now, philosophically, though, what is a soul? And there are a number of different views on this. The Thomistic view that its substantial form is one view. The view that I prefer is actually that we should understand the soul as a non-material substance. That's to say, it is a mental subject. It has certain modes. Now, mode is a term from philosophy. Mode is a property instance. So if you had a piece of gold, then its yellowness, the yellowness of that piece of gold, would be a property instance, and it could not be detached from that object. It has its own yellowness. Okay? We can also apply the idea of modes to mental substances, because we notice that we all have our own individual wills, reasons, and we also have our own thoughts, right? Our thoughts cannot be detached from us. Notice, therefore, that no one else can have Jack's thought that Denmark is beautiful. Someone might agree and say, yes, I think Denmark is beautiful as well, but then that would be their thought. It would not be Jack's thought. So what's interesting about thoughts is that they are intrinsically subjective. They have to belong to the mind of one person. So you have some very fine libraries here in order, so I understand. Okay, and yet in those libraries, there are no thoughts. There are lots of books that contain lots of information, but the only way any thoughts arise is if somebody actually goes in there and reads them. Okay, I'm helping out the professors here by bringing that up. Okay. And that is simply because you cannot have an ownerless thought. A thought always is the thought of someone, and it presupposes, therefore, a mental subject. So thoughts are modes of thinkers. They cannot exist without thinkers. This helps us to understand why materialism really cannot capture the idea of a soul. For materialism, you basically have physical objects which are aggregates of smaller ones, molecules all the way down to atoms and then subatomic particles. Okay? Well, the brain is a physical aggregate. It's an aggregate of neurons with various connections, and we could go down to lower levels. All of those levels, though, you would find aggregates of parts, and they are separable parts. So if you take a neuron, and this is kind of a rather revolting idea, but you could certainly take a neuron out of somebody's brain, and it would be intrinsically the same outside of their brain as it was in the brain. Now, its connections to other neurons, of course, would disappear. Those are extrinsic changes, right? But in its intrinsic nature, the neuron is the same whether it's in your brain or outside your brain or even in somebody else's brain. You know, perhaps you want to help them on their Hebrew homework, and you're good at Hebrew, right? And so you give them a neuron or something like this. And so there can be ownerless neurons. But what we just noticed is that thoughts are not like that. In this sense, souls are simple. Thoughts cannot be separated from thinkers. Okay? What that thought is. So my thought that Denmark is beautiful is necessarily tied to me. And you can't have that thought even if you agree with me. Okay, you have your own thought that Denmark is beautiful. We agree in the content. But you can't have my thought and I cannot have your thought. And so thoughts are intrinsically personal. This is one of the biggest puzzles for materialism, because materialism wants to say that consciousness and thought must somehow emerge when you have a complex enough physical structure. But all it has to offer is complex aggregates, and those aggregates consist of separable parts with extrinsic relations to one another, okay, like to the left of, to the right of. Thoughts, however, have to belong to the life of a particular thinker, and they have intrinsic relations. So that's how souls are very different from the brain. Now, as we know, materialism, that is the view that the physical world is all there is, matter is all there exists, denies the existence of the soul. It denies the existence of God as well, on the same grounds. Really, it denies the existence of irreducible mental substances. So they can't be God, they can't be souls, and they cannot be angels or any other mental substance on the materialist view. And so they hold that everything must reduce to or depend on the physical. And what I'm going to talk about first is the three main arguments that materialists have against the soul, and then some responses that defenders of the soul have. An excellent book here, by the way, is by Charles Tulliver. It's spelled Taliaferro, and Stuart Gertz, a brief history of the soul. And at the end, I have a list of some good titles, but that's an excellent one that looks at different historical views of the soul from different theologians and philosophers. And I think it's very fair in its presentation of different views. So, put rather in strong terms, okay, the three materialist arguments against the soul are, first of all, these are kind of all known as prison metaphors, right? That they're locked out. The physical world is closed to souls on the materialist view. There's no way that souls could have any impact on anything physical, right? So they're locked out. Just as, notice, God is locked out, the denial of miracles, so is the soul on the materialist view. Another objection that's been developed over the centuries is that in any case, if you had a soul, if it did do something, it would violate physical laws. Okay, somehow it break laws, and usually they mention especially that it would violate the conservation of energy. Because if your soul did something, there'd be some energetic implication, and that would be something that would go against the conservation of energy law. And more recently, and you'll notice that it's not only non-Christians, but also Christians, Christian physicalists like Nancy Murphy at Fuller Theological Seminary, who maintain that you can somehow square Scripture with the idea that we have no souls. And there are other ones, Kevin Corcoran, Calvin College, who deny the existence of the soul. And the reason they do is they claim that, well, with the advances in neuroscience, souls explain nothing. You don't need them around. They're redundant. Okay, so there's a rather sad thing, right? Looks like you just lost your job. You go back to factory, you're locked out. If you demonstrate you're a violator, and then they tell you you're redundant. Pretty depressing for the soul, okay? So just to explain these a little bit more, first I'll explain the objections, and then I'll talk a little bit about possible replies to them. So the first objection is they're locked out. If souls exist, then of course they would change what happens in the world. So, you see your friend and you wave to your friend because your soul wants to, well then your soul made your hand move. And so it made a physical difference to the world. And materialists typically claim, well that would violate what's called the causal closure of the physical. That's a term used by philosopher Jae-Gwon Kim, okay, at Brown University. And the idea of the causal closure of the physical is simply this, that on a materialist view, for any physical event that you pick, like my hand moving, it must always have only a physical cause. Okay, so they'd be okay with saying that some physical event in my brain led to my hand moving, that's okay, but not with the idea that my soul is the reason that my hand moved. All right? So that's the first objection. Here's how he puts it in his book, Philosophy of Mind. Pick any physical event, trace its causal ancestry, so you go back, what were the previous events? This will never take you outside of the physical domain. From physical events, you will always trace it back to other physical events. And he points out that that's a mandatory belief for a materialist, because otherwise you are going to be allowing all kinds of things, and potentially even God, if you allow that there can be non-physical causes, and then you wouldn't be a materialist anymore. So it's the sort of common denominator of all materialist theories, despite their great diversity. Now, why should anybody believe that principle? It's a good question, because I actually don't think there's a good reason to believe it at all. But people believe it because they're impressed by science. This is particularly clear when you read Nancy Murphy, that she's just very impressed with science as the place to find out what's going on in the world. And our culture is imbued with scientism. It thinks if you know something, it's because there's a scientific answer, and it does not accept non-scientific answers, and particularly theological answers to questions. So the causal closure principle is assumed by the idea that physics is in principle complete. Because if you give a complete physics, you wouldn't expect there to be any mental causes operating in it, right? So that's the argument. If you think physics can be completed the same way it operates now, there wouldn't be any room for any mental causes or souls and things like that. So that's the first objection, that they're somehow locked out and couldn't do anything. Second objection, if they did, if we waive the first objection and say, okay, well perhaps souls could do something, then the worry is that that would violate laws of physics. Because if you take any physical event which derives from a previous physical cause, and then you have a mental feature, and that's involved somehow, and it alters what would happen. Okay, so suppose your brain is in a certain state, and its being in that state would normally simply lead to your arm moving a certain way, but now you make a free choice, and your arm doesn't move that way. well then it looks as if now we have violated some sort of physical law, because something that was going to happen according to a physical law now doesn't happen. So that's the idea. And more specifically, it's not just any old laws, it's the idea that, well, in physics, generally when things move, including bodies, that will involve a transfer of energy. And so, in the law of conservation of energy is usually put in two ways. The careful way of putting it is that the total amount of energy in an isolated system remains constant. It seems like, well, if a soul did something, wouldn't that change the amount of energy, and so violate that? And the less careful way, assumed incorrectly, by the way, to be equivalent, is the claim that energy cannot be created or destroyed. And so the objection is, if the soul did change a physical system, it would create energy that would affect the brain, and it would violate the law of the conservation of energy. So that's the second objection. And then finally, redundant. You see this in the work of philosophers like Ted Honderich of London University and Paul Churchland. Paul Churchland says that our ordinary ways of speaking about our mind, our beliefs and our desires and our choices are all folk psychology, right? And that folk psychology is doomed to be replaced by a pure neuroscience account, which would only appeal to things like activation vectors in the brain. And so if you could explain anything that anybody ever does simply by talking about their brain state, what role is there for the soul to explain or do anything? So if there's nothing the soul can do that put crassly the brain, actually it's the rest of the nervous system too, but if the brain can do it all by itself, why do you need the soul, right? I mean, that's a very clear statement. Here's a humorous slide. I don't know if this will be funny in Denmark. It might just turn out to be British humor. I'm originally from the UK, but there's this help stamp out and abolish redundancy. A message from the Society for the Abolishment and Removal of Redundancy Society. Okay, this probably doesn't carry very well, but you know the idea is redundancy in English is where you keep repeating the same thing over and over again by saying it more than once, like I'm doing now. Right? Okay. Anyway, that was a joke. I think we'll move on now. It usually doesn't ever work to take jokes to different cultures. You have to find out what their jokes are, you know. All right, so that was the objections, and they're all powerful, and they're all still urged by contemporary philosophers, right? So if the soul is going to be defended as a credible idea in a modern scientific age, then philosophers who are concerned for biblical anthropology need to have some sort of response to that, to explain, well, how can we still believe in the soul? A very good book, which you may have seen, that I highly recommend on this, is called The Soul Hypothesis. The Soul Hypothesis, because it deals with why you should think that the soul is a worthwhile idea from a scientific perspective. All right. So I'm going to respond to each of those three objections that we heard. Why we can reject causal closure, souls don't have to violate laws, and they're not redundant. So first of all, we pointed out that really the only reason to believe the causal closure of the physical that's ever given is the idea of the in-principle completeness of physics. But, in fact, the more you analyze that idea, the more doubtful it is that physics is completable in the way that the materialist thinks. First of all, obviously, you cannot define the idea of completed physics in terms of current physics. It's not complete. So you can't say that we finally have physical answers for every question. If you look, for example, at Craig Keenan's two-volume study of miracles, there are numerous miracle reports both in ancient times and in the contemporary world, and there are no credible physical explanations of these things. And there are many other phenomena like this. And we simply don't currently have a completed physics. And people like Stephen Hawking wouldn't say that we do. They all think we're searching for a final theory. So we don't have a final theory. Secondly, though, what if you try and define it by future theorists? Well, this would be really an argument from ignorance, because we don't know if we are going to be able to complete physics. Maybe we just discover that we have cognitive limitations. There are certain things that we're not capable of understanding, so we don't know if that's going to happen. Much more interestingly, though, is the second point, that as science advances, it seems that it is beginning to accept that you do have to admit a role for the conscious observer. If you've looked at quantum theory is a very interesting area of physics, where it appears to assume that the scientific observations of the science, what the scientist is doing, actually affect the system that is being observed. And so in that area of physics, you actually have a model or a paradigm where consciousness is assumed to have a role in what you were studying. So this might be true. It might be that suppose there is a completed physics that we find. Well, maybe it will finally come to include a role for conscious subjects. And notice, if that was true, physics would refute physicalism. Physicalism is just a term in philosophy of mind, really for materialism. It's really a very similar term. And physics, it may then allow what are called downward mental causes, that is, from the consciousness to the brain to the physical world. It might allow an influence for consciousness. And if that's the case, then physics would actually be incompatible with the causal closure of the physical. Now, to understand why this is plausible, we need to go back to how modern science appeared. And one of the most important things about it, if you go back to the 16th and 17th century, they made this distinction between primary qualities, which are actually in the object, like its extension and motion, and secondary qualities, which dealt with colors, smells and things like that, because they had a subjective dimension. It was assumed that science could really only deal with the primary qualities, and physics then becomes the task of the geometry of matter in motion. You describe how things move through space, because that's completely objective, but what you subtract is subjectivity. And so modern science very largely appeared by removing conscious experience as something that science couldn't study. You'll notice, for example, Newton's laws of nature, like forces, mass times acceleration. They're all from no particular point of view. The idea of a law of nature is it's the same for everybody, regardless of your subjective reaction. Well, how did they do that? By ignoring precisely the conscious subjective side of our life. They couldn't deal with it. And there's B. Alan Wallace, a nice book, The Taboo of Subjectivity. It's sort of off limits for science because it doesn't know how to handle it. And London philosopher Nicholas Maxwell points out, well, from your refusal to study something, it certainly is not logical to conclude that it doesn't exist or it isn't important. So it might be that you have a pirate who's looking for treasure, and he has a map of Treasure Island, but he says, well, I'm not going to go and check there, because on the map it says, here there be dragons. Okay? That doesn't show that the treasure isn't buried there. And likewise, the fact that science chose to ignore our conscious life does not show it doesn't exist or that it's unimportant, and it ultimately does need to be addressed. Thomas Nagel came to the same conclusion. This is a wonderful book by him, although he is an atheist and a very public one. he at least, I think, is honest about the phenomena that needs to be explained. And he says that standard materialism has no credible explanation of consciousness, rationality, or the moral demand. And he points out you can't really understand a scientific worldview unless one assumes that the intelligibility of the world is itself part of the deepest explanation of why things are as they are. So in a completed science, you have to explain why the scientists can understand the world. And at that point, you have to bring in consciousness and mental states. It's a very profound point. I think Nagel is really one of the best philosophers in the world. I wish he were on our side. maybe Lord willing, he will be one day. And, you know, here's some scientists. Schwartz and Beauregard are both neuroscientists, and Henry Stepp is a quantum physicist. And they simply point out that choices made by an observer will affect the outcome of what is measured when you're looking at systems of particles. And one of the examples that they mention, there are actually many of these, is called the quantum Zeno effect. That if you keep observing a quantum system in its evolution, it tends to fixate a certain state. Sometimes it's called the watched pot effect because of the idea that, well, if you watch your teapot, it seems never to boil. It seems to fixate in the same state, right? And so likewise, if you watch this system, it doesn't develop. And so they hypothesized that maybe in the brain, when you're considering many actions, and you have these different action templates, maybe finally what makes you choose one is conscious fixation of one of those states. Conscious attention, therefore, they argue, might play a role in fixating one of those. And very briefly, I'll talk about some other empirical evidence that consciousness plays a causal role. The cost of consciousness, even from a biological point of view, if consciousness doesn't do anything, then it's hard to see why we'd have it. And in particular, Alvin Plantinga has argued, why is it that when I consciously want a drink of milk, I regularly open the fridge? In other words, I do an action that makes sense in light of my conscious desire. It's not that, you know, every so many times when I consciously want a drink of milk, I do Spanish table dancing, right? My desires are reliably correlated with my behaviors. Why is that? Unless there is a causal connection. And then there are these medical discoveries, cognitive therapies for neurological disorders connected with neuroplasticity, that the brain can be changed, the placebo effect in psychoneuroimmunology. So I'll just briefly go through these. Notice from a biological point of view, if consciousness doesn't do anything, it's epiphenomenal, to use that fancy word, then there's no reason why it reliably would preview our behaviors. You could think anything, right? If what you think has no impact on what you do, then your thoughts can be about absolutely anything. All that matters from the point of view of surviving, right, which is what the materialist is concerned about, explaining your behavior by natural selection, is that you in fact produce a behavior that keeps you alive or helps you to reproduce. So if your body runs away from lions, it doesn't matter what you're thinking. In fact, even if you want to be devoured by the lion, okay, and you like that, if you like that idea, doesn't matter. You'll still stay alive as long as your body, in fact, runs away from the lion. Cognitive therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder, and many others. There's many other cognitive therapies. But this is the idea that when you know that you've locked your door, but you feel uneasy, so you check it again. Or you know you've turned off the oven, but you feel uneasy, so you check it again, right? And maybe we all have some of these, you know, you check things obsessively. And it creates a kind of a brain lock where you have a cycle in the brain. And it was assumed by materialists for many decades that only drugs or conditioning could possibly help with that. And then some scientists, including famously Jeffrey Schwartz, show that in fact cognitive therapies work, where you simply ask the patient when they feel that unease to consciously refocus on alternative behavior, and gardening for some reason seems to be a very effective one. Okay, just think gardening, and then over time you could detect that there were actual changes in the neural pathways, and that people would no longer have this obsessive desire to check things that they knew didn't need checking. Placebo effect is a remarkable one. This was studied before brain scans were available, but the key thing here, I won't read all of this, but just the fact that your trust in a physician or a procedure or even the hospital itself is correlated with a higher likelihood that you will recover from an illness. That's a mental variable, right? Here's something that you feel and how much trust do you have, and that affects your health outcome. Those are the higher level of trust heal faster than the others. That suggests that the mind is doing something. And more generally, we know that stress, which is something mental, right? You consciously experience stress, is a killer. The people under stress is correlated with increases in their heart rate, their respiration, but also toxic chemicals in the bloodstream. Stress can quite literally kill people, especially if they're already sick from something else. And so helping people to become calm, one technique that's been studied in several American hospitals is mindfulness-based stress reduction, so that people become calmer and are more accepting of their body. They enjoy not only mental benefits, relaxation, happiness, but also physical benefits. And so it's the psychological affecting the neurological, and it's the immune system, and therefore making you healthier. So it seems to me that when we look at these medical advances, and also what's happening in quantum physics, we see that science requires an active role for the observer. And therefore, downward causation is possible, and the causal closure principle is false. Secondly, souls don't have to violate physical laws. The issue here goes back to C.S. Lewis and Miracles, where he points out that laws don't say what has to happen under all condition. Laws are always conditional. They say if you have a certain cause and if you have the right initial conditions, then the effect will happen. Newton's laws don't predict a thing unless you have initial conditions. Okay? Well, notice if you have a conditional, that says nothing about what would happen if the cause was different or if the initial conditions were different. So here's the classic Newtonian billiard ball table case. Given the initial conditions and motion of one ball, you can compute what A, you can compute what B will do. True? But that's perfectly compatible with you jogging the table and changing the cause, or changing the initial conditions in some way. That would not violate the law. Laws, in fact, always hold given certain caeteris paribus conditions, i.e. other things being equal. But if you make a free choice, your soul does something, other things are not equal. Just as when God does a miracle, as Lewis argues, that does not violate the laws of physics. All that happens is there's new input. So it's like a computer program. A computer program does not always produce the same output, because of course you can change the input, and then a different input would be mapped to different output. So there's the actual conditions, but that does not mean that we could not have different possible conditions. Very long time ago, I used to be very good at pull, but now I never have any time to play, so any one of you could thrash me now. So. The real reason that materialism rejects the idea of mental causes isn't the laws of physics at all. It's simply the assumption that the world is a closed system, and that begs the question. Because the theist, of course, denies that it's a closed system. If God exists, creates the world, and can intervene with miracles, there's no reason why souls also could not intervene. Conservation of energy. These are the two statements. Well, the total amount of energy in an isolated system remains constant. Well, the defender of the soul can simply say that the system is not isolated if the soul is operating. That's not a problem. What about that version? Energy cannot be created or destroyed. Well, that would certainly prevent the soul from doing anything. Trouble is, people assume that these two are equivalent, and they're not. Number one does not imply number two at all. And no theist should accept number two, because then you can't give an account of the creation of the universe. When the universe appears, you have energy created. And so the appearance of the universe would be inconsistent with two. And Robert Larmer, in his most recent book, The Legitimacy of Miracle, points that out. That principle one does not imply principle two, and no theist should accept principle two anyway. It's really incompatible with everything that we know about cosmology, because it does seem to be a matter of scientific fact that energy came into existence. The energy conservation law is not supposed to deny that possibility. It simply is a law about what happens when you have some energy. It doesn't say anything about where energy comes from in the first place. And philosopher of physics Robin Collins points out that we cannot say that energy conservation is required for all causation, even in physics, because it does not hold in relativity theory when you're looking at gravitational fields, and it also cannot hold for certain quantum phenomena where two particles are twinned. Because when you have twin particles, they can be separated an arbitrary distance, and then what one particle does is always mirrored by the other particle. If that was energy transfer, it would have to be faster than the speed of light, which to our knowledge is impossible. And therefore, if that's a causal correlation, it cannot be one which happens by energy transfer. So the point here is that if even in physics, causation does not have to involve energy transfer, why insist that it's required for the soul? Now, souls also have work to do. What could they explain that we couldn't explain by brain states, you may ask? Well, a couple of things. Our ability to consciously reason. Here is a paper which I published in 2011, The Ontological Argument from Reason, meaning that if you think about what is ontologically required for somebody to reason, you discover that it requires the existence of a mental substance. And Scott Smith, colleague and friend of mine, also has argued that souls are required for it to account for our knowledge of the world. Now think about it. Why is this important? Science assumes that we can reason. Science assumes that we can know the world. So it is not going to be acceptable for materialists to say that somehow materialism has shown we have no souls, if the consequence is we can't reason and know things, since of course science does require those abilities. So reasoning requires actually many things, but four main things. To account for reasoning, for example, if you would follow a very simple piece of reasoning like A equals B, B equals C, therefore we all see the answer is, right, A equals C, because identity is transitive, right? We can all do that. What's though required? Ontology is about what exists. What's required for that to be the case? Well, you have to have a conscious self that's united at a time. There has to be one being that unites both of the premises, A equals B and B equals C, because only if there's one entity that understands both can you infer the logical connection. Because otherwise it would be like Adam believing just this one, A equals B, and somebody else believing the other one. And then neither of them have a good reason to draw that conclusion. There must be one thing that holds both premises. Okay? When you look at what the materialist, though, says about us, people like Daniel Dennett, they say that the brain is revealed to us as basically a highly distributed parallel information processor. And we look at the processes going on in the brain. We do not find that the signals have to all go through one place. It's a highly disunified system with signals being processed all in different tracks, like different tracks on a railway line. And if that's the case, it's hard to see how you could unite different pieces of information, especially if the argument were more complicated than this one. And then there'd be no entity that could reason to that conclusion. So that's one problem. Now you might say, well, that's a problem, but how does soul start? Well, remember though, for the soul, all of your thoughts are intrinsically tied to just one person, you. So it's the same soul that thinks A equals B, that owns that thought, as also thinks B equals C. There is one thing that has both thoughts, because they both belong to that soul. Just like when you feel cold, want to put a coat on, you like warmth, you want to have a cup of coffee, right? One soul can have all of those at the same time. You also, though, have to persist over time. To draw that conclusion, Jack has to be the same conscious self at T2 as he was at T1. Because otherwise, it would be like one individual would believe the premises and another one believes a conclusion. So if Adam believes this and Sarah believes that, well, Adam didn't survive long enough to draw the conclusion. He just ceased to exist. And Sarah got the right answer, but she did not, in fact, reason to it. It just appeared in her mind somehow, right? Because she hadn't existed previously. So you have to exist as the same thing over time in order to be credited with reasoning. Now, what about materialism? Well, the problem is when we study the brain, we discover that it is in a state of constant flux. From flux, nothing but flux, right? You get constant change. And so there is no brain state that's constantly present. And here's a statement from Mario Beauregard about the brain. No single brain area is active when we're conscious and idle when we're not. And there's no specific level of activity or chemistry that is constant throughout all states of consciousness. So you can be conscious and be thinking about a topic like Kant's essay about what is enlightenment for an extended period of time, and yet in fact your brain is making vast changes throughout that. And so it's not the brain really that explains your extended consciousness over time. Now the soul helps because the soul is a mental substance, and a substance is precisely something that can change despite, that can remain the same despite changes in its accidental property. So you can be having different thoughts over time, but it's the same soul that is having those thoughts. Which thoughts that are your, this is the term here is your recurrent thoughts, the ones that you are currently thinking about. They can change, but it's nonetheless the same mental substance that's having those thoughts. So if materialism is true, there is no one thing which endures from one time to the next. But if you have the soul, it will endure as the same mental substance because its essential properties can stay the same, even though the particular thoughts it focuses on change. Subjectivity, when you reason, you have to interpret your beliefs. You have to know what they mean. And you have to see what follows from them. And that requires then a mental subject. Calculators and computers don't interpret their output or see what it means, right? They're simply engineered so that they will get the right answer. But it's futile to ask your Macintosh computer, do you see what I mean? It just doesn't see what anything means, right? That's the problem. Now, materialism basically says we are organic computers. As Marvin Minsky charmingly put it, machines made out of meat. So then, to explain their transitions, they can all be explained in impersonal terms. You can do transition diagrams for computers, and you can do the same thing when you're looking at the changes in the states of the brain. You never have to bring in subjectivity to account for the transition from one state to the next. Now, a computer, notice, does make transitions in agreement with reason, because that's how it's engineered. You could, of course, also engineer computers that have a bad arithmetic and illogic unit instead of an arithmetic and logic unit. There's no reason why you couldn't. We just choose to engineer computers so that their answers will agree with arithmetic and logic. But it does not follow that they actually understand the reasoning process. Why not? Well, one reason is it doesn't see that a conclusion follows because it lacks subjectivity. The soul helps because it's a particular subject. It provides a unique point of view on the world, and it can interpret its thoughts and see what follows from them. Intentionality, this is a rather long word. It's very important in philosophy. It's the aboutness of our thoughts. So you can think right here about Budapest or the Taj Mahal, and you don't have to be in any physical relation to them. You can also think about future events, so certainly those future events are not causing you to think about them. And you can think about non-existent objects, like the magic pumpkin. Okay, so our thought is not limited to things with which we physically interact. And our thoughts have intentional content. So if you think that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, then that's the intentional content of your thought. To explain reasoning, it has to be based on content. You have to come to believe A equals C because you believe that A equals B, and because you believe that B equals C. It doesn't work simply to say, well, I was in brain state B56, and now I'm in brain state B57. That's not an account of reasoning. That's something that a computer can do. But it's not really an account of your reasoning because you didn't come to this conclusion because you see that it follows from these contents, from what this says. So the problem is materialism says that when we look at physically described systems, there is no intentionality. A rock or a computer states are not about anything. Now, admittedly, we talk about a computer states meaning something, but that's because it's derived intentionality. In other words, it comes from our point of view. So when we input data, we say that that's sales figures. But for the computer, of course, it's simply another set of numbers which is converted into binary. It doesn't mean anything to the computer. Same, though, is true of the brain. When we look at the brain as described by neurochemistry, for example, its states are not about anything whatsoever. So you can study the brains of people who are in love, but nothing that you learn will tell you about what it's like to be in love unless you actually ask the person. Now here's the problem. The consistent materialism has to say that either intentional states don't really exist because they don't seem like normal states. They're not normal causal physical states, since you can believe in things that don't exist, for example. Or they don't have causal power. And so if there is this transition to the conclusion, it's not because of the content. It's just because of the brain state that you were in. And that is not an account of jack reasoning. It's simply transitions in agreement with reason. But any pocket calculator, makes transitions in agreement with reason, because that's how it was engineered. And we can't conclude, and shouldn't conclude, that the calculator is reasoning. That's the point that was long ago made so powerfully with John Searle's Chinese room argument, if you've looked at that, right? When you look at how computers process information, they simply match patterns and do not have to understand what any of those patterns mean. So the soul helps because there are intrinsically mental states, and this is because the soul itself is a mental subject. And you can say that thoughts are by nature of their objects. Okay, so